The debris field began 3 light minutes from Earth's moon. That detail would trouble Sector Admiral Vraylon for the rest of his life. Not the debris itself, but what was missing from it. He'd reviewed the sensor logs 14 times. He knew what a destroyed vessel looked like. He'd seen the aftermath of 17 engagements across 4 star systems. Destroyed ships left signatures, hull fragments tumbling in predictable arcs, cooling metal radiating in infrared bands, atmosphere venting in crystalline plumes that caught starlight like scattered salt. The debris field contained none of that. Just silence, and small, drifting objects he couldn't identify. He reached out one elongated finger and touched the edge of the display. The objects were roughly spherical, roughly uniform in size. They had been distributed, and that word would keep him awake for weeks, distributed across a volume of space approximately 30,000 kilometers wide. He pulled up the analysis his science officer had submitted 12 minutes ago. Read the first line. Stopped. Set the report face down on his console. 17 hours earlier, the Hegemony fleet had dropped out of transit exactly as planned. 100,000 warships, the largest coordinated military force ever assembled in recorded galactic history. The interstellar Hegemony had spent 11 years constructing this fleet, 7 years training its crews, and approximately 4 months deciding whether the species that occupied the 3rd planet of this unremarkable yellow star system actually warranted the expense. They had decided yes. The reasoning was bureaucratic, as all extinction orders were. The humans had violated 31 articles of the Hegemony's expansion protocols simply by achieving faster-than-light travel without authorization. They had made first contact with 3 client species without going through proper diplomatic channels. They had, most damningly, refused 3 separate formal requests to submit themselves for classification and integration. They had refused politely. That somehow was worse. Admiral Vraylon had read the refusal letters himself. Each one was courteous, thoughtful, and completely immovable. The third one ended with a line that his translator rendered as, "We appreciate your patience, and we want you to know we take this very seriously. We're simply not ready to have that conversation yet." The Hegemony Council had debated for 6 hours. Then they had issued the fleet order. It was not technically a decision to destroy humanity. It was a decision to demonstrate capacity, to appear at the edge of human space with overwhelming, irresistible force, and allow the humans to understand what compliance looked like in practical terms. If they submitted at that point, they would be integrated harshly, but alive, stripped of their faster-than-light capability, reduced to a client state, their unusual biology and apparent creativity cataloged as resource assets. If they did not submit, the fleet would proceed. Vraylon had commanded 3 such demonstrations. In all 3 cases, the species had submitted before the fleet crossed the outer boundary markers. He had expected the same here. The humans had not submitted. They had done something else entirely. The first mystery was the silence. When 100,000 warships dropped into a star system, it was not a quiet event. Transit emergence generated electromagnetic wash across 17 detectable frequency bands. It disrupted local gravity gradients. It was, by design, impossible to miss. Every civilization Vraylon had ever approached had reacted to transit emergence in one of 3 ways: immediate distress broadcasts, immediate military alert signatures, or immediate surrender transmissions. Usually some combination of all 3. The humans had done none of these things. For 9 minutes and 40 seconds after the fleet's emergence, there had been complete silence from the direction of the 3rd planet. No transmissions, no power signatures shifting to military configurations, no launches from orbital platforms, nothing. 9 minutes and 40 seconds. Vraylon had spent those 9 minutes feeling something he didn't have a precise word for. It was adjacent to unease. The silence felt less like shock and more like, he searched for the concept like a held breath. They know we're here, said Tactical Commander Chauveth, standing at the secondary console. Their detection capability is confirmed. We saw active scanning within 30 seconds of emergence. Then why aren't they transmitting? Unknown. The second mystery arrived at exactly 9 minutes 40 seconds, when a single human vessel emerged from behind the moon. One ship. It was not large by military standards. It was not particularly well armed, based on the energy signatures his sensors were reading. It moved at a speed that was impressive for human technology, but not remarkable in absolute terms. It was heading directly for the center of the fleet formation. Vreeland stared at it for a long moment. "What is that?" he said. "Appears to be a communications vessel, Admiral. The hull configuration matches the human diplomatic class their records." "One ship." "Yes, Admiral. They sent *1 ship." Chauveth did not answer immediately. Vreeland could tell she was trying to find a logical framework for this behavior and failing. He appreciated her honesty in not pretending she had one. "Sir," she finally said, "our psychological assessment models suggest this could be a deliberate signaling strategy, projecting calm to avoid appearing weak through visible panic." "Or they simply aren't panicking," Vreeland said. Another silence. "That seems unlikely," Chauveth said carefully. Vreeland didn't respond. He watched the single human vessel continue its approach, steady and unhurried, crossing the enormous distance toward the center of 100,000 warships with the apparent urgency of a vessel that had a destination in mind and every intention of reaching it. The third mystery was the message. When the human ship came within standard hailing range, it broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. A short message. His translator worked through it in seconds. "This is Commander Elena Vasquez of the Earth diplomatic vessel *Threshold. We know why you're here. We'd like to talk first, if that's agreeable. Not we surrender, not we yield, not please we beg you. We'd like to talk first." As if they had an alternative in mind for afterward. Vreeland agreed to the meeting because he was curious, and he believed that was a forgivable reason in the circumstances. 100,000 warships could wait an hour. Commander Elena Vasquez came aboard alone. That was the part he kept returning to afterward. She came aboard alone, into the command vessel of a fleet that had been dispatched to end her civilization, and she walked through his corridors with a translator device clipped to her collar, and a physical posture that his body language analysts later described, with visible confusion, as relaxed forward orientation. Relaxed. She was approximately 1.7 meters tall, bilaterally symmetrical, covered in the soft organic layer his files called skin, which was a warm brown tone and which showed on her neck and left forearm what appeared to be old injury scarring. She wore a uniform in dark blue with small insignia he didn't recognize. She had brought nothing else. No security, no second diplomat, no visible equipment beyond the translator. She sat across from him at the conference table and looked at him directly. His species found prolonged direct visual contact confrontational. He held it anyway, because he was the admiral and he would not be the one to look away. She said, "You're going to want to hear what we've already done before we talk about anything else." He said, "I'm listening." She reached into her uniform and placed a small data device on the table between them, slid it toward him with 2 fingers. "That's 3 years of logs," she said. "I'd suggest starting with the entries from 14 months ago." He had not touched the device yet. "What will I find?" "Evidence," she said, "that this conversation was always going to happen. We just wanted to make sure we were having it on reasonable terms." He stared at her. "Commander Vasquez, you are aware of the size of my fleet." "Yes." "You understand what it's here for?" "Yes." "And your response to that is to offer me a data device and use the word reasonable." She looked at him with an expression his analysts couldn't classify. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something that lived in the same neighborhood as a smile, but was made of different material. "Admiral," she said, "you've been in this system for 27 minutes. In that time, have you conducted a full census of your fleet?" He went very still. "We recommend it," she said. The census took 9 minutes. Vraylon stood at his command display and watched the count come in from across the fleet's 1,000-vessel communication net, and he felt the number changing under his hands in a way that made no physical sense because numbers didn't change under your hands. But this one did. It kept adjusting downward. 97,400. He checked the figure against the pre-transit manifest. 100,000. He looked at Chauveth. Her face had done something he had never seen it do before. Every military officer he had ever worked with maintained composure under pressure. It was the first quality selected for in command positions. Chauveth had maintained composure through 3 engagements, a transit accident that had killed 11 crew members, and a political tribunal that had questioned her judgment in front of the full Hegemony Council. She was not maintaining composure now. 2,600 vessels, she said. Her voice was barely above its normal register, but it had lost its steadiness. Approximately 2,600 vessels are not responding. Find them. Sir, we've been trying to locate them since the count began. They're simply, she stopped. They're not present. There are no distress signals. There are no wreckage signatures. They're not present. That's impossible. Yes, she said, it is. He turned back toward the conference room where he had left Vasquez. He walked back in without announcement. She was sitting exactly as he had left her, hands folded on the table in front of the data device, watching the door as if she had known precisely when he would come through it. 2,600, he said. 2,612, she said, but we weren't trying to be precise about the number. He sat down. He did not intend to sit. He meant to remain standing, to remain dominant in the physical space. But his body made the decision independent of his intent, which had never happened to him before. How, he said. That's a long answer. She glanced at the data device. Most of it's in there, but the short version is that we've been preparing for your arrival for 14 months. We knew you were coming. We know how you operate. We know what a demonstration fleet looks like. We've watched you do this to 3 other species, and we spent a long time discussing how we wanted to respond. He pulled the data device toward him. 2,600 ships, he said, almost to himself. In transit, while the fleet was in transit. You found and removed 2,600 ships while they were inside transit space. While they were in transit, she confirmed. What does that mean, removed? She was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, he would learn to read the difference. She was choosing. We took them apart, she said. Carefully, we wanted the crews to survive. And did they? Another pause. Most of them, she said. Here is what Vraylon had misunderstood for the entirety of those first 27 minutes. He had categorized humanity's silence as shock. He had interpreted the single diplomatic vessel as either a calculated bluff or cultural peculiarity. He had read Commander Vasquez's composure as professional training under extreme duress. All 3 interpretations were wrong, and the data device made this clear across 4 hours of evidence he reviewed without stopping, without eating, without speaking to anyone on his staff. The humans had not been silent because they were panicking. They had been silent because they were working. 14 months of preparation. Not defensive preparation, not the frantic construction of weapons platforms or fortification of orbital positions. The humans had spent 14 months solving a problem in mathematics that the Hegemony's own physicists considered theoretically impossible. Penetration of transit space without a vessel of one's own in transit. They had not solved it perfectly. They had solved it in the way Vreeland would later reflect that humans appeared to solve most things with enormous sacrifice, partial functionality, and complete willingness to accept a solution that worked despite being ugly. The transit space incursion devices were not elegant. They were, by the testimony of the engineers who designed them, nearly as dangerous to the humans deploying them as to the targets. The casualty rate among the teams that had operated them was substantial. The humans had proceeded anyway. 2,612 Hegemony vessels had been disassembled inside transit space, a dimension that no civilization had ever successfully weaponized, by human teams operating equipment that had killed a meaningful percentage of the people who used it. The 9 minutes and 40 seconds of silence had not been shock. It had been the last of the operation completing. The single diplomatic vessel had not been a bluff. It was what came after. The humans had already done what they intended to do with the fleet. Now they wanted to talk. He read this understanding into himself slowly, like cold water. Then he found the section of the data device that made everything worse. "You didn't target military vessels," he said, when he returned to her for the second time. Vasquez looked up from the small physical object she had been holding, turning it over and over in her hands while waiting, something small and smooth and dark that he couldn't identify. She put it away when he entered. "No," she said. "The 2,612. You had 14 months and you specifically selected," he checked his notes, "logistics support, medical transports, long-range communication relay vessels." "Yes." "You left the warships intact." "Yes." He set his notes down. "Why?" "Because we weren't trying to win a fight," she said. "We were trying to make a point, specifically that we could have removed different vessels, that we chose not to, that we're choosing not to right now." She met his eyes directly. "We're giving you a fleet that still functions militarily. You can still complete your mission if that's what the Hegemony decides to do. We just wanted you to know that completing it would be an asterisk decision, with information, rather than an inevitability." He stared at her. "And if I order the fleet to advance?" Her expression did not change. "Then we'd have to have a longer conversation." "About what?" "You've demonstrated a single, remarkable capability against ships in transit. Once the fleet breaks formation and begins direct approach." "Admiral," she said it quietly, "you've been in this system for 4 hours. Have you located all of your missing vessels yet?" He stopped. He had not. He had been reading the data device. He turned back to his command console, called up the search status. 61 of the 2,612 had been found. As debris fields. Small drifting objects, roughly spherical, roughly uniform in size, distributed, that word again, asterisk distributed across specific volumes of space he had not thought to analyze as a pattern until this exact moment. He pulled up the distribution map with shaking hands. The fields were not random. They were positioned at precise intervals along every viable approach vector from the fleet's current position to the third planet. Every corridor, every angle, every gravitational path that a fleet of this size could realistically use. He looked at the small spherical objects that his science officer's report had identified, and which he had set face down on his console 17 hours ago, and now needed to pick up and read. He picked it up. "Read the first line again." This time he read the second line. "The objects appear to be human-made devices of unknown function. Initial analysis suggests they are inert. However, given that standard analysis failed to detect the transit space incursion capability until after it was employed, we do not recommend treating inert status as confirmed." He put the report down. He sat for a very long time. Then he went back to Vasquez for the third time. She was standing when he entered, standing at the viewport looking at the stars, doing something he hadn't seen from her before. One hand was pressed flat against the glass, Not dramatically, not in distress, just resting there, fingers spread. He understood suddenly that she was looking toward her planet. It was not visible from this angle, but she was looking in that direction anyway. "What are the spherical objects?" he said. She lowered her hand. "They're listening devices," she said. He waited. "Mostly," she said. "Mostly. We wanted to be honest with you." She turned from the viewport. "They're listening devices. They're also the housings for a second-stage delivery system that we haven't activated. We really did want this conversation to happen first. We really do want a different outcome than what your fleet was sent here to achieve. That's not a diplomatic formula. We genuinely," she stopped, started again. "We have a lot of people on that planet, Admiral. We like them. We'd like to keep them." "Then why?" He stopped. He felt the question reshaping itself in his mind, becoming something more precise. "Why not simply yield? We offered terms. If you have these capabilities, you clearly invested heavily in preparation. Why spend the resources? Why accept the casualties? Why spend 14 months building this, rather than simply?" "Because the terms required us to stop," she said. "The integration terms, we'd have to stop. Slower than light only, client-state classification, no further contact with species we hadn't been authorized to contact." She paused. "We can't do that." "Why not?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Because we've already met people out there," she said. "People whose civilizations were integrated by the hegemony 40 years ago, 80 years ago. We've been in contact with client states your council doesn't know communicate with each other. And we've seen what they gave up, what they're not allowed to do anymore, what they've forgotten how to be." "They're asterisk protected," Vraylon said, and heard the inadequacy of it as the word left his mouth in a way he never had before. "They're asterisk contained," she said, not unkindly. What followed was not a negotiation. Vraylon would resist that word for years. It was an education. Vasquez opened the data device to sections he hadn't reached yet. 14 months of logs became something larger, 8 years of logs, accumulated before the hegemony fleet had even been authorized, collected by human vessels moving carefully through client-state space, interviewing beings who were technically not permitted to give interviews, recording things that were technically not permitted to be recorded. Species that had ceased producing art within 30 years of integration, not legislated out of it, simply stopped, as the administrative requirements of client-state compliance consumed the cultural space that art had occupied. Species with oral history traditions that had fragmented when the hegemony standardized their communication protocols, and the old languages became incompatible with the new administrative framework. A species, he read this entry twice, that had possessed a mathematical tradition unlike anything else in the cataloged galaxy, a different foundational approach to number and relationship, and had lost it when their young were required to learn hegemony standard mathematics for compliance purposes. The tradition was gone. The people who had held it were dead. No record existed because the hegemony hadn't thought to record it before standardizing. "You're describing institutional inefficiency," Vraylon said carefully. "Not malice, not cruelty. The hegemony doesn't." "I know," Vasquez said. "That's the hardest part to explain, actually. If it were malice, it would be simpler. You could decide to stop being malicious, but it's systemic. It's the asterisk structure that does it, not any individual decision. The structure optimizes for certain things: stability, predictability, interoperability, and in doing so it eliminates variance, and variance is where," she stopped. "Variance is where we come from, all of us. Whatever we are now, it started in the variance." Vraylon was quiet for a long time. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "A different kind of relationship," she said. "Mutual, not hierarchical. We're not asking the hegemony to dismantle itself. We're asking to not be integrated into it. And we're asking you to revisit the classification of the species you already integrated, and to consider, just consider, what recovery of lost cultural variance might look like for even some of them. The Council will never, The Council, she said, doesn't know yet that 2,600 of its ships are gone. It doesn't know we had this meeting. It doesn't know about the second stage delivery systems. And it doesn't know about the communication network between client states that we've helped to build over the past 6 years. She folded her hands on the table. We're asking you to tell them. We're asking you to go back and have an honest conversation about what you found here. About what we're willing to do and what we're willing not to do. And if the Council's response is to send another fleet. She looked at him steadily. Then we'd have to have a longer conversation, she said. And he realized, sitting across from this one human who had come alone aboard his flagship with a data device and an old scar on her forearm, and a small smooth object she turned over in her hands when she thought he wasn't watching, that she would have that conversation. She would have it in every conversation after it, for as long as conversations were what was required, and if they weren't, she would do something else with the same calm, forward-leaning, unhurried posture she had walked through his corridors with. He looked at her forearm. What happened there, he said, he hadn't intended to ask. She glanced at the scar. Transit Space Incursion Device, 14 months ago, the first prototype. She said it without performance, without self-pity, with the specific flatness of a person describing something factual. We lost 8 people that day. We figured out what we'd done wrong and we kept going. He didn't say anything. That's what I need you to understand, she said quietly. Not the devices, not the capability. That's just the part you can see in sensor logs. What I need you to understand is that we lost 8 people on the first try and we kept going. We'll keep going, Admiral. We'll keep going longer than your council expects any species to keep going. Not because we're exceptional, not because we're special, because that's just what we do. The fleet census was finalized 2 hours later. 2,612 vessels confirmed absent. No debris except for the 61 that appeared in the approach corridors. Crew survival rate for the absent vessels, per the data provided by Vasquez, approximately 89%, present on human-held orbital facilities and unharmed. Vreeland read the crew survival figure twice. The humans had extracted and preserved the crews of the vessels they disassembled inside transit space. He tried to model what that would require, operationally. Tried to imagine the human engineers who had built devices that killed some of their own operators, in order to also save the lives of Hegemony crew members who would have followed orders to destroy the human homeworld. He couldn't fully construct the logic. There were pieces of it he couldn't make fit in a shape he recognized as reasoning. He suspected that was the point. He sent his report to the Council. All of it, the census figures, the transit space capability, the communication network among client states, the data Vasquez had provided, his personal account of the conversation, his recommendation, for the first time in 23 years of fleet command, against proceeding with the assigned mission. He attached a note at the end that was not standard in fleet reports. It was 2 sentences. In 17 years of demonstration fleet commands, I have never encountered a species that had clearly won a confrontation before it began and asked to talk rather than to demonstrate that fact. I am not certain what to do with this, but I believe it matters. The Council's deliberations would take 11 days. Vreeland stayed in the system. On the 4th day, Vasquez came back aboard, having returned to her planet in between and come back. A transit that took her past the approach corridors with their distributed debris fields, and sat across from him and answered questions for 6 hours from his analysis team. On the 7th day, one of his junior intelligence officers submitted a supplemental report, noting that the human communication device Vasquez had left aboard, the one she'd asked them to please return when they were finished with it, had been transmitting since the first day. Not anything sensitive. Just a low-frequency ping on a tight beam frequency that his systems hadn't flagged because it was below standard monitoring thresholds. The ping was in the direction of the human planet. Letting someone know where Vasquez was, every hour, automatically. Vreelan looked at the report and thought about a small, smooth, dark object being turned over in human hands. He did not know whether the ping was a security measure, so humans would know if the flagship changed position with her aboard, or a comfort measure, so she would feel tethered to home. He thought it was probably both. He thought those two things were probably inseparable for humans. The Council's response arrived on day 11. It was not a surrender. It was not a capitulation. It was the thing that, Vreelan suspected, Vasquez had always known it would be, because she had read the Hegemony's internal documentation the same way she had read everything else, carefully, completely, with the patience of someone who knew that understanding a system was the first step in changing it. The Council proposed a provisional non-integration status to be formalized over 18 months of negotiation. They proposed an independent commission to review the cultural impact assessments of existing client-state integrations, staffed by members who included 3 human observers. They proposed a communication protocol for client-state to client-state contact, which was the thing they had forbidden for 400 years, and which they proposed now not because they wanted to, but because they had looked at the evidence that it was already happening, and concluded that a world where humans were formally outside the hegemony and informally assisting client states in illegal communication was less preferable than a world where the communication was acknowledged. It was not everything Vasquez had asked for. It was more than Vreelan had believed the Council would give. She read the proposal in his conference room. He watched her face while she read it, and she had the same quality of controlled, unhurried attention she'd had in every conversation, but at one point, at one specific paragraph, which he would later identify as the section about the Cultural Impact Commission, she stopped. She did not make a sound. She looked at the page for a moment longer than the reading required. Then she continued. She set the document down. "We'll accept this as a starting point," she said. "Your government agrees." "They'll agree," she said, not arrogant. Certain, in the way she was certain about most things, not because she couldn't conceive of being wrong, but because she had thought it through, and this was her conclusion. He looked at her. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, "and I want you to understand this is not a negotiating question. This is personal curiosity." She nodded. "The 8 people," he said, "from the first prototype, were they volunteers?" "Yes." "Did they know they were likely to die?" She was quiet for a moment. "They knew it was possible. We didn't know the probability yet. We found that out." "And the others who came after? The ones who operated the devices, knowing the casualty rate from the first attempt?" "Yes." "Also volunteers?" "We couldn't have stopped them," she said, and something moved in her expression. Grief, he thought, was the closest he could name it, or maybe love, or maybe those were the same thing in human faces. "We tried with some of them. They didn't have a concept of you can sit this one out that they could apply to themselves." He looked at her for a long time. "I don't understand you," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I have been in the Hegemony fleet for 31 years. I have met many species. I have never encountered anything I understood as poorly as I understand your species right now." "That's fair," she said. "It doesn't trouble you." She picked up the small, dark object. It was in her hand before he'd seen her reach for it, the reflexive comfort of it clearly involuntary. "We don't need to be understood," she said. "We just need to be met. There's a difference." The fleet left 11 days after it arrived. Vreelan watched the third planet grow small on his aft sensors as the formation began its transit sequence. 100,000 warships, minus 2,612, moving in formation away from a yellow star and a blue-green world that had spent 14 months taking itself apart and putting itself back together in a shape no one had designed or predicted. The debris fields in the approach corridors were still there. The spherical objects drifting, listening, she'd said, and the housing for a second stage capability she'd chosen not to name precisely. He pulled up the science officer's report, the one he'd set face down twice, and read it completely for the first time. The third paragraph noted that spectrographic analysis of the spherical object's outer material suggested they were not manufactured. The material was consistent with natural origin. They had been collected, processed minimally, and shaped. They were, functionally, rocks. Specifically, and the science officer noted this with evident discomfort, they were consistent in material composition with the rocky body of one of the system's asteroid belts. The humans had apparently harvested them, placed them in the corridors, given them just enough surface treatment to make them scan ambiguously on hegemony sensors. They were rocks. That might also be something else, because the humans had said so. And he had believed them and moved his fleet accordingly. The last thing in the science officer's report was a single appended line, added after the main analysis. Request clarification on whether we should continue devoting resources to identifying the second stage delivery system. Current models cannot determine whether it exists or whether Commander Vasquez described it specifically to influence our behavior. Both possibilities seem consistent with the evidence. Vraylon read that line sitting in his command chair with the transit sequence counting down, with 100,000 ships preparing to slip between the folds of space and carry a report back to a council that was already in the process of changing how it thought about one small stubborn species around one unremarkable star. He didn't answer the science officer's question. He sat with it, sat with the fact that he didn't know, that he couldn't know with the evidence available, that Vasquez had constructed the situation specifically so that he couldn't know, which meant the second stage delivery system, real or imagined, would continue to exert exactly the same gravitational pull on every future decision the hegemony made about this system forever. She had built a weapon out of uncertainty. And she had taken the scar to do it, and lost 8 people on the first attempt, and come aboard alone with a translator and a data device, and a smooth dark object she held when she was thinking of home. The transit sequence completed, the fleet slid into the fold between spaces. Vraylon looked at the last sensor image of the system as it disappeared. The yellow star, the debris fields, the small blue-green world that had looked at 100,000 warships, and instead of surrendering or fighting, had quietly made sure the conversation happened on its own terms. He thought about what she'd said, "We just need to be met." He thought about the species that had forgotten their mathematics, the language that couldn't run on new protocols, the art that had simply stopped. He thought about what the hegemony called protection, and what the humans called containment, and how much space there was between those two words once you'd sat across from someone who decided that space was worth dying in. The star vanished. The sensor cleared to the featureless gray of transit space. Somewhere in the approach corridors of a system he'd just left, rocks drifted in the dark between one possibility and another. Maybe inert, maybe not. Maybe it didn't matter which. Maybe the humans had understood something that every other species had missed, that you didn't need a weapon capable of winning the war. You only needed the enemy to believe, with sufficient evidence, that you were the kind of people who would keep building weapons until you found one. They hadn't proven they could survive what the hegemony would send next. They had proven something the hegemony had no classification for. That they would try *. Not because they were certain of victory, not because their technology was superior or their biology was exceptional or the mathematics of the situation favored them, but because 8 people had died in a prototype and 20 more had gotten in line, and one woman had walked alone into the flagship of a civilization that had come to end her world, with nothing but a data device and the unhurried certainty of a species that had already decided, "We will not stop." They would not stop. That was the thing Vraylon could not classify, could not quantify, could not enter into any threat assessment model he possessed. The galaxy had seen strong species. It had seen fast species, clever species, ancient species with technologies so refined they had become invisible to lesser civilizations. The hegemony itself was built on the assumption that sufficient force, intelligently applied, could redirect the behavior of any sentient species. What the hegemony had never accounted for, what no civilization, in 4,000 years of recorded galactic history, had ever needed to account for, was a species that looked at sufficient force and did the math and concluded, "We cannot match this, therefore we will simply not stop until we can." Not defiance, not heroism. Just the absolute, patient, scar-bearing refusal to accept that the conversation was over. Vraylon closed his eyes in the gray of transit space and thought that perhaps the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was not a weapon. It was a species that had learned to treat every ending as a beginning, every wound as a data point, every defeat as a first attempt. The universe was very old, and it had seen many things. It had never seen anything like this.